Have you ever sat in a room full of people and felt completely alone? Not because no one saw you, but because you saw too much? The awkward pauses, the forced laughter, the shallow rhythm of small talk that feels more like noise than connection. Most people move through it without a second thought, but not you. You think deeply, feel everything, and question the parts of life others take for granted. You're the kind of person who walks into a space and immediately picks up on tension no one's naming. Who notices patterns between people, cycles in behavior, the quiet details in a conversation that don't quite add up? You can't help it. Your mind works differently. Carl Jung had a name for people like you, though he rarely spoke about them directly. He once described a type of person who doesn't just look at the surface of things, but who sees into the soul of the situation. Someone intuitive to the point of discomfort, visionary, but often misunderstood. In Jung's lifetime, he believed these minds were so rare, they often felt invisible to society, if not completely alienated by it. This isn't some personality quiz on the internet. This is a psychological profile built from Jung's direct writings, decades of observation, and his belief that some people are tuned into a deeper frequency, one most of the world has no idea even exists. And here's the catch. Jung believed that this kind of mind, as powerful as it is, also comes with a risk. A mind that can go deep is also a mind that can get lost. A mind like that, if left unanchored, doesn't just drift, it spirals into anxiety, into despair, into isolation, into madness. That's what this is really about, the psychology of deep thinkers. Not just the strengths people love to romanticize, but the struggle, the daily weight of seeing too much, the mental and emotional toll of having to live in a world that's built for speed, not depth. So, if you've ever wondered why you feel exhausted after talking to people, why you need to disappear just to feel like yourself again, or why your thoughts never seem to rest, this might be the first time someone's actually explained that to you without making you feel broken. This is the story of how Carl Jung saw minds like yours, the rare insight he offered, and what it really means to live and survive with a brain that refuses to stay on the surface. There's a kind of thinking that doesn't turn off. It keeps spinning, even in the quiet, especially in the quiet. You're brushing your teeth, and suddenly you're replaying a conversation from 5 days ago. You're watching a movie, and instead of just following the plot, you're dissecting the character's childhood trauma, or wondering why the director made a certain visual choice. You notice patterns in your friend's behavior that they haven't picked up on yet and probably won't. Most people assume deep thinking is about intelligence, that it means you're some kind of walking encyclopedia. But that's not it. Being a deep thinker is less about knowing facts and more about being unable to let things go until they make sense. The mind refuses to settle for surface-level explanations. It keeps digging into ideas, people, systems, emotions, because it has to. But here's the thing most people don't talk about. It's exhausting, because while you're caught up trying to understand everything, life keeps moving. Everyone else seems to adapt quicker. They let things go. They make faster decisions. They don't spiral over the meaning of a text message or the tone someone used in a conversation. You do. And it's not because you're dramatic. It's because your brain is running on a different frequency, that internal intensity. It doesn't always show up on the outside, but it's always there. A constant hum of thought, like background noise you can't shut off. Carl Jung understood this inner world. He wrote about the people whose thoughts weren't just ideas, but lived experiences. He said that some people don't relate to the external world first. They relate to the images, emotions, and symbolic meaning inside their own minds. That's where they live. And stepping outside of that, into social interactions, or fast-paced environments can feel like culture shock. You might notice how drained you feel after small talk, not because you're antisocial, but because it feels like wading through static. You're craving something more real, more meaningful, more honest, but that kind of connection doesn't come often. So you retreat into books, art, solitude, or silence, not because you're hiding, but because it's where your mind finally feels like it can breathe. This is the emotional rhythm of a deep thinker: constant processing, intense reflection, a need for depth in a world that rarely offers it. But what Jung noticed, and what few others did, is that this mental structure isn't a random quirk. It's a psychological type, a pattern, and it comes with both power and risk. So what exactly was Jung pointing to when he talked about people like this? He called them introverted intuitives, but those words don't fully capture it. This wasn't about someone who's just shy or someone who has good instincts. This was a deeper structure of the mind, a way of processing the world that turns inward first, every single time. Jung believed that introverted intuitive types don't start with facts or data or even emotions. They begin with images, inner visions, gut-level perceptions that show up before logic has time to explain anything. They see the shape of a thing long before they can describe it. And they spend most of their mental energy trying to make sense of what they've already sensed. Sound familiar? Imagine someone who notices a friend acting slightly off, subtle stuff, a delay in response, a smile that doesn't match the eyes. Most people wouldn't even register it, but a deep thinker feels it, not in words, not consciously. It just lands as a quiet, something's wrong, and then it lingers. They can't drop it. Their mind turns it over until a bigger pattern starts to form. That's the introverted intuitive's default mode. Jung described this type as rare, not because it's better, but because it's harder to function with in modern life. It doesn't prioritize survival or speed. It prioritizes meaning. So someone with this pattern might struggle with deadlines, but lose track of time writing pages of reflection no one asked for. They might find social norms confusing, but be deeply attuned to the emotional undercurrents of a group. They can sit in silence for hours and still feel like they've had a full experience. But there's a cost to that kind of perception, and Jung was honest about it. He warned that introverted intuitives often appear strange to others, not necessarily because of how they act, but because of how they don't. They hesitate. They wait. They can't always explain their thoughts right away, or why they see the world the way they do. And that delay, that pause, it gets misread by parents, by teachers, by friends, as being disconnected or aloof, sometimes even as being depressed. Jung once said that this type lives in a twilight, not fully rooted in the present, not fully lost in the unconscious, always dancing between the two. And without awareness, that can become dangerous. Because what happens when your whole inner world is alive and vivid, but the outer world keeps demanding that you play along, nod politely, and keep up? You start to fracture. Here's where things get complicated. When your mind is wired to look beneath the surface, what happens when it goes too far? What happens when depth turns into a kind of trap? Jung saw this clearly. He believed that the same mental structure that allows for deep perception also makes someone vulnerable to inner disorientation, especially when they're isolated, misunderstood, or forced to suppress what they naturally see and feel. In his words, the introverted intuitive type is often misunderstood because they are not oriented to reality in the usual way. And when the external world dismisses your inner world, you start to doubt your own perception. You pull back. You stop sharing. The depth doesn't go away. It just gets turned inward, with nowhere to land. That's when overthinking stops being reflective and starts being self-destructive. Have you ever noticed how sometimes your thoughts don't feel like thoughts anymore? They feel like loops. You're not solving anything. You're just circling. Maybe it starts as a small worry. Did I say the wrong thing? Did they mean something else? But instead of fading, it lingers. Your mind keeps running it in the background like it's trying to crack a code that doesn't exist. Days pass, and you're still stuck. That's not insight. That's entrapment. Jung warned about this descent. He called it being swallowed by the unconscious. It's when the imagination, once a gift, becomes an overload. When intuition stops guiding you and starts pulling you into paranoia. Dreams turn into nightmares. Insight turns into suspicion. And the mind that used to feel expansive now feels claustrophobic. You might look fine on the outside. You might even keep performing well at work or school. But internally, it's chaos. And nobody knows, because deep thinkers often become expert maskers. You learn to pretend everything is normal. You learn to play the game. But the cost is silent burnout. Here's the truth most people avoid saying out loud. Deep thinking can become a mental health risk if it's not grounded in reality. You need anchoring, connection, expression. Otherwise, the depth just becomes noise. This isn't a flaw. It's part of how the type functions. Jung never framed this as pathology. He saw it as a risk that comes from potential left unintegrated. So the real question is, how do you integrate it? How do you keep your depth without losing your footing? If you've ever felt like there's a version of you you don't fully understand, one that shows up in moments of stress or silence or hides behind your thoughts like a fog, this is the part Carl Jung was most concerned with. He called it the shadow. Not in a supernatural sense, not some villain living inside you. The shadow, as Jung described it, is the collection of all the parts of yourself you've rejected, denied, or buried. And for deep thinkers, it tends to be heavy. Because you've been paying attention. You've seen what the world rewards and what it doesn't. You've learned, sometimes painfully, which parts of yourself are too much. Maybe it's your sensitivity. Maybe your skepticism. Maybe your intensity. So you push those traits down. You hide them. You become easier to deal with. You start shaping your public self around what's acceptable. But the shadow doesn't disappear. It waits. And eventually, it comes back louder. That might look like sudden anger that feels out of character, or shame that sticks around longer than it should, or dreams that rattle you awake with feelings you can't quite explain. It's the moment you say, "Why did I react like that?" and genuinely don't know. For deep thinkers, the shadow often takes the form of emotional repression. You might process everyone else's behavior with ease, but when it comes to your own needs, your own pain, you go blank. You intellectualize it. You journal around it. You quote philosophy instead of admitting you're angry or scared or lonely, because feeling it directly feels like losing control. Jung believed that the only way to grow, truly grow, is to confront the shadow, not to destroy it, but to integrate it, to admit what's there, even when it's messy, even when it threatens your image of being the thoughtful one, the calm one, the self-aware one. He warned that if we don't do this work consciously, it will happen unconsciously. And that's when we project. That's when we start seeing our rejected traits in other people. The selfishness, the neediness, the fragility. We attack them in others because we can't face them in ourselves. So ask yourself, what are the parts of you that make you uncomfortable? What emotions do you apologize for before you've even expressed them? That's where your work is. And this is where Jung's process of individuation begins, where you stop trying to be the ideal version of yourself and start becoming a whole one. This is where Jung parted ways with most traditional psychology. He wasn't trying to fix people. He wasn't interested in conformity. He believed the goal wasn't to become normal, but to become whole. That process, he called it individuation. Now, that word might sound abstract, but what it really means is learning how to live with all the parts of yourself, not just the ones you like, not just the ones other people praise, but all of them. Your instincts, your contradictions, your childhood wounds, your unspoken needs, the things you've outgrown and the things you're still clinging to. Individuation is the work of becoming fully yourself, instead of a version of yourself curated for approval. For deep thinkers, this matters even more, because your mind won't let you ignore contradictions for long. You might try to keep things together, but your psyche remembers everything. The guilt you thought you buried, the dreams you said were unrealistic, the version of yourself that got left behind so you could fit in. If you've ever felt like you're living next to your own life instead of inside it, that's a sign that part of you is waiting to be integrated. Individuation is how that reunion begins, and it's not glamorous. It doesn't happen during a weekend retreat or by reading the right book. It happens in small moments, when you admit you're tired of pretending, when you notice yourself numbing out and decide to stay present instead, when you catch yourself criticizing someone and ask, what part of me am I really upset with right now? It happens when you stop trying to rise above your emotions and start sitting with them long enough to hear what they're actually saying. Jung believed that deep thinkers are especially suited for this work because of their inner focus, but that same inner focus can turn against them if they avoid the uncomfortable parts. That's the paradox. You're wired to explore the psyche, but to survive it, you have to bring light to the places you usually ignore. You have to express, create, share, not for validation, but for integration. Maybe that means writing, not to impress, but to understand yourself. Maybe it's therapy, if you're tired of carrying things alone. Maybe it's having one real conversation this month where you stop filtering your truth just to keep the peace. Individuation isn't about self-improvement. It's about self-retrieval. And if you've been lost in your thoughts lately, or disconnected from what you really want, it might be time to come back. So the question becomes, once you start doing that, once you begin becoming whole, what role does a deep thinker actually play in the world? What place does a deep thinker actually have in a world that moves fast, prizes simplicity, and often rewards performance over reflection? Jung believed that deep thinkers weren't just introspective, they were necessary. He wrote that, the more you become who you truly are, the more you become a vessel for something greater. That might sound lofty, but what he meant was practical. People who can sit with complexity without needing to rush toward resolution, who can feel deeply without flinching, who can see the patterns under the surface. These people hold a mirror up to society, not to judge it, but to help it grow. Think about it. Who are the people who question harmful systems before anyone else notices they're broken? Who are the ones who sit with grief long enough to write something honest about it, or create something that makes others feel less alone? Who's quietly catching the emotional tone of the room and adjusting their words so someone feels safe enough to speak? It's not always loud. It's rarely recognized, but it matters. And no, that doesn't mean you have to become a therapist or a writer or a monk. The role of the deep thinker isn't tied to a job title. It's tied to a way of being. It's in how you move through conversations, how you respond when others shut down, how you carry nuance in places that flatten everything into black and white. Maybe your role is being the one person in your friend group who doesn't immediately give advice, but listens, really listens. Maybe it's how you mentor someone who's struggling in silence. Maybe it's how you parent, or how you resist the pressure to pretend everything is fine when it's clearly not. And look, none of this makes you immune to burnout. You're still going to get overwhelmed. You'll still second-guess yourself. You'll still feel, at times, like your depth is a liability more than a strength. But it's not your job to speed up for the world. It's your job to stay rooted and invite the world to slow down where it needs to. Because the truth is, depth is becoming rare, and people are hungry for it, even if they don't say it out loud. That brings us to one final thought. If you've made it this far, then maybe something in this landed deeper than words. Maybe you've seen yourself in the patterns, in the silence, in the struggle to explain a mind that never really stops. You're not alone in that. Jung didn't think deep thinkers were here to escape the world. He thought they were here to meet it differently, to see what others miss, to hold tension where others rush to fix, and to make sense of complexity without turning it into noise. But to do that, you first have to know your own mind, sit with it, work with it, let it be real. And that's the quiet truth. You don't have to change who you are to be understood. You just have to stop abandoning the parts of you that don't make sense to other people. Because those parts are often the ones that hold your depth, your vision, your insight. Jung once wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. It's not always easy, but if you've been called intense, or distant, or too much, maybe you're not broken. Maybe you're just tuned into something others haven't learned how to listen for." So take your depth seriously, not in a way that sets you apart, but in a way that brings you back to yourself. And if anything here felt familiar, if it made you pause or feel seen, say something in the comments. What part of this resonated with you? What are you still figuring out about your own mind? You never know who might need to read it. Thanks for being here. Keep going inward and keep coming back. Until next time.